answer some of the questions by Dr. Isam for half an hour, and then the second session would start about the evaluation of performance and policies. We have six interventions. Each commentator will have no more than 3 minutes. We will start with Dr. Hamad Khalifa Siddiq from Khartoum. Please go ahead. My comment is about some of the issues that were included in Professor Haj Ali's paper, where he mentioned that the Salvation government started with a system of conferences and said that it was representative of the people and the so-called leading society, and we were told that there was a leap into the succession system. My comment would be that there was a gradual change towards that succession rather than a leap, because at the beginning the Salvation government didn't want to introduce a different system, so they started with a conference system. But I believe there may have been some internal assessment of the situation at the time, which confirmed for the Salvation government that they needed to re-establish the plurality and multi-party system so that they are not in discordant with the international community. So they moved towards succession, and this political succession law was introduced, and there were some political organizations and structures involved. So this involvement of partisan plurality had its own problem, but it was one step along the way towards pluralism, to also test whether that system would be suitable for Sudan at the time. Professor Hassan also mentioned the ethnic and tribal tendencies, and as one of the main problems of the Salvation government. And he said that the introduction of community leadership may have codified the issue, but I believe that this ethnic and tribal tendency and affiliation was already there, where we had within the structures of the movement itself some tribal affiliations taking over. And ever since those tribal and ethnic affiliations started to become very salient and prominent, although before that most people did not care for ethnic and tribal affiliations. So I believe there must have been some factors that played into the emergence of this tendency, which exists and persists up till now and causes a lot of marginalization and exclusion, etc. Also, diagnosing the reasons for the setbacks is important, because it's one of the most important lessons learned, and we cannot exclude the military wing from this evaluation, because the use of the security-based option means the solidification and strengthening of the military wing. So this security branch, which is supposed to, this requires an in-depth discussion and why the security was given prominence over other branches. And there was a question whether if the security branch was the main reason for the fall of this movement, or the overthrowing of this movement, and the fall of the Islamic experience. Does this mean that this was inevitable? This may be not an inevitable end, but an important uh, step or a warning sign. Uh, so, is it, for example, probably a chance to review this experience in order to resume a new experience which is better based on lessons learned? And also, the issue of appointment by loyalty. I don't think that it was true in absolute terms. So, one person, for example, would be appointed in a certain position. Sometimes they have loyalty and allegiance, but they are strong and qualified and independent. But you will replace those with people who have allegiance and subservience. So that was what was problematic. It wasn't just about allegiance, but it was about subservience. Uh, and obedience, so to speak. Finally, Mr. Abdul Shafi also mentioned the Sudanese experience is peculiar, and this is important when approaching and examining the experience in Sudan, because this is not related just to the management of the state or the development of the Islamic movement on the ground or in society, because what may be suitable at a certain point in time in a certain place may not be necessarily suitable in a different time. So, for example, uh, a military coup is not an appropriate option, while a popular uprising or revolution may be more conducive. But also, we have the Arab revolutions, which reached to nothing. So, to what extent is it okay for Islamic movements to take power through problematic means, or what other means do they have? Thank you so much.
الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Hussam, the experience of the Islamic movement in Sudan is what stands out about it is that it tried to maintain independence of Sudanese decision making and
الغرب. ايضا الحركه الاسلاميه في كما ذكر الدكتور حسن حاج علي من الجبهه الاسلاميه دستور الجبهه الاسلاميه القوميه في طوال هذه الفتره هي شاركت في العمليات الانتخابيه في 65 وفي 86
throughout the period before they took power, they took part in the political process. And in 1986,
الحركه الاسلاميه مناصر يعني ساعدت الدوله الانقاذ وما قبلها فرق كبير.
So the Islamic movement is old even before the salvation government. It's always aiming at the as state with institution, and even the strength of its institutions was very obvious. Of course, Sudan has a place in terms of the strength of the state and in the region. Before the siege, there were very important achievements in the field, and it was followed by a lot of treaties and agreements, like the Khartoum peace process, etc., etc. And one of the important positions as well was the elections. So, for example, you're talking about in 2010 there were elections, and all of the world uh, were observing these or watching these elections, and although the people are saying that there were no elections. In addition to that, there was high education. The Sudan was educating even the people, even the areas that were in fight with the state. As for the legality, some people who speak about legitimacy or legality, especially the Western democratic states, they only recognize the legitimacy that they approve of, and if they don't or disagree with the state, so they don't consider that country as a legitimate. What the Islamic movement has done is that it addressed everybody, graduates from public schools, private schools, military, civilians, and we can see how much was it successful to address all of these groups of the people. So we need to put a framework for the military institution with its Islamic depth and its depth with the society. As in terms of the parallel institutions, some people consider that one of the advantages of the state. Uh, because these parallel institutions, I will give you an example. For example, the popular defense. It's under the general law, and it was not established to replace the army and armed forces, for example. So these institutions, it was a new experience in the world or in the Arab world to see how successful they were, and it was a model for others.
زي ما قال الشنقيطي قال الترابي لما جه في الانقلاب قال الفاعليه غلبت المبدئيه. طيب الفاعل والترابي تحدث عن الدوله الحديثه باعتبار ابتلاء انا ما ممكن
Al-Turabi talked about the state with all the institutions that are there.
بهذه المؤسسات. اختم بالكلام عن الدكتور الترابي والتجربه التاريخيه.
I will conclude on commenting on the experience of Al-Turabi. I believe that one of the great experience is that the theorizing figure was more obvious in that on that experience.
يعني تقليل من شأنه في انه السياسه بتحتمل هذه المساله والصراع السياسي حق المساله دي حق
So this matter,
الانتقال من المبادئ للبرامج
in terms of the topic of moving from the principles to programs, and she mentioned that instead of the link with the international organization, for example, of Muslim Brotherhood, it was coordination, and it was not receiving information or receiving orders from Cairo. So everything is happening according to the society, the needs of the society, and what is required by the people there. Thank you very much. Now we move to our colleagues in Istanbul, and we will start with Dr. Nizam.
بسم الله الرحمن بسم الله شكرا على الدعوة. أنا عندي
Thank you for the invitation. I have 3-4 points. Some of them are questions and some of them are comments. On the first paper, the paper of Dr. Hassan Al-Haj, he said that from the literature available and that developed with the programs of the movement, some of the literature that are related to the broad lines, and then they were improved by the Islamic constitution and other, but all of them were talking about the standard issues like justice, fairness. Even Al-Turabi himself, he was even not only talked about politics, he also talked about philosophy and theology. So Islam was the source of all of that. So it wasn't there. There haven't been a heavy political meal, so to speak. So we need to dig deeper to talk about that experience. And most of the slogans were Islamic more than political. And from those papers, I didn't hear the influence of the economic networks. Has have these networks improved? Were they present in all of the phases? Are they the same network of interests that are present here? Is something that Dr. Isam touched upon when he talked about the deep state. And I believe that this network has influence on everything that is happening place in Sudan. The other point from Dr. Mahjoub, he talked about a paradigm shift. I don't see any paradigm shift. I see accumulation, because when you get into a state like Sudan, that you come through a military coup, you are boosting the way that has been already there in Sudan. Who's going to break this cycle? And even when you come to the authority, the governor becomes concerned about remaining in power. So that's the same thing that is happening every other place or in other military coup. So I didn't see anything that has changed on the ground. But so maybe it is in theory is the present, but it's not on the ground. So I don't see any paradigm shift here to talk about in this experience. I believe what we can learn from Al Turabi, may he rest in peace, is that he opened the door to deal with the military, with the Islamic ideology as a mystic or as a myth or as a puzzle. So we need to dig deep. We need to think about it. We don't have collective creativity. We have individual creativity in some places here or there. So that's what we can learn from him. But what's happened in Sudan? There was a link of a coup and then a link of theorization, which led us to the problems that Sudan is living today. Thank you very much. I have two comments. The first one, we didn't hear from the papers any or sufficient indicator about the regional and international factors that affected the 30 years experience in Sudan. If we think about the most important points, for example, the besieging the south, the Darfur war, we can see a lot of the impact of the regional and international forces. So we didn't have any assessment and we didn't hear any strong indicators referring to this influence. The motives or the incentives of the regional players in Sudan were different. Some of them refused to have any model in the region that is democratic, semi-democratic, or a stable country, because it will embarrass them and put them in comparison with the regimes in power. Some of them are opposing Sudan for economic reasons. Some of them are because they don't want Sudan to become a strong economic state, and some of them for ideological and religious reasons. So each of those players had reactions that were translated into measures, actions, and changes to that affected Sudan, and Sudan in turn had its own reaction to adapt or to these changes. Another comment is an international phenomena. In most of the world, the diplomatic action retreated in favor of the military action and security action. So this has been reflected in the Sudanese experience. So the obstructing the development of Sudan wasn't only in diplomatic means. We had military use and military power that was used against Sudan in that field. So this leads us to ask a question that any experience, no matter how rational and no matter how good is it internationally allowed to continue? And I believe that the problem of the Salvation government is that they haven't given the international factor its appropriate weight, and when they became in power. So the question for us here is it allowed to any political experience that is different from the semi-familial models that are present nowadays to continue in place? The other question is Sudan allowed to be an independent, strong state? These are new additions that we've learned from the experience of Sudan. So I hope that this factor is giving its real weight in this experience. Thank you, Dr. Khalid Hassan Ibrahim. Go ahead, please.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا.
Thank you.
في تعقيبي عن ورقة الأخ دكتور حسن حاج علي الرؤية
Commenting on Dr. Ali Hassan Haj Ali with Mr. Hassan Haj Ali, I agree with him with what he said in his paper, especially towards the end. He said or he talked about the importance of setting standards and selecting topics to be measured within a time frame. This is very important. So if we want to make assessments about the vision and the practice, we need to put these three things. His paper was very heavy, and because he was going through very quickly, he couldn't get into the details and how in line the vision, the practice was with the vision, or how far away or distracted was it. So we need to set the time frame and put indicators for example, fairness, justice, freedom, shura, and indicators for the society, as well as indicators for the development and movement from poverty, or the percentages of poverty, etc., etc. So I believe for making such assessment, we need to have to gauge that with the tools that are available to conduct such measurements in order to get to reach very useful outcomes. In terms of the paper of Dr. Muhammad Haj Ahmed Haroun, he said that he is not he's not judging by the tool, but about the consequence of the tool that was used. And this is strange because people sometimes in people escape the question: can the Islamic movement use the force to get to power? This is a very important question. And here in the last question that was asked here in the room, is any Islamic movement that is coming through elections allowed to continue? We have experience that we have seen. And when Al-Turabi was asked about the necessities, he said that there is the necessity of self-defense. And if it is very highly justified. The question that was mentioned here is that the Islamic movement that is got into power by coercive force cannot be judged by the means, but by the ends. So this is something that is available and that we can see. And now the talks about the false democracy in the world and the accusations that are put toward against the Islamic movement is just a kind of self-defeat, and that I believe that this is a useful and legitimate means in the practice of the Islamic movement. As for the third paper, what Dr. Suhair mentioned about the Hassan al-Turabi, and Dr. Isam raised the questions because something was problematic in the paper, because he said that he was representing a wide openness and he was the political branch of the military organization. But what they missed is that the organization of the Islamic movement is still there, which was built upon the understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood, is still there since the beginning or the establishment, reaching the Islamic front and the Charter front. The same ideology or the same ideas are there, and it is expanding with its political practice, and it goes in line with the Islamic, the wider Islamic practices. So how can the indicators of success be put, and how can we measure these issues? This organization is monitoring the performance of the state and rationalizing and then setting the standards for all of these things. Dr. Isam asked, how, after you rejected the military or the armed work, are you going to get back to it? No, after 76, there was a strategy, the strategy of enablement in certain institutions, and it was reviewed continuously. And it in the 80s, when they came to power, it wasn't something that came by coincidence, but after a lot of strategic and planned and well-studied work. I hope the speakers, the keynote speakers in Sudan, be ready, because after 3 minutes we're going to listen to them. Thank you very much for inviting us to this important symposium to study this, to study the practice of the Islamic movement in Sudan. I will comment on the three papers. The first one is on the first paper. I believe that this paper is just an introduction for a genuine assessment of the or evaluation of the experience, and it requires the work of research centers in Sudan and then, or those that are concerned about Sudan in the Arab region, in order to evaluate the Sudanese experience and the Sudanese experience in the periods of the pre-salvation government, during and post the salvation government, and to have indicators about health, education, and all other aspects, in order to have genuine evaluation, and not only things or general observations, in order to understand whether Sudan is now living better off than it was before, or is it now more developed, or is it poorer? So we need to build that on indicators and figures, and not to speak in general terms about these issues. I believe 30 years is very are enough to evaluate this experience. When speaking about the issue of reaching power by coercive force, I believe that this is an experience, and my colleague here mentioned that it came after phases of political involvement, and the use of using the military coup came after the accumulated experience. So the Islamists were keen on this topic, but we need to evaluate and ask a question: why they selected that option, the military coup, I mean. And we need to evaluate also the Sudanese experience during their when they were in power. Did they democratize the country or not? I believe that they did so, but we need to talk about the democratic diversity there. This is something that we need to mention. There was a national conference that represents the Islamic movement and other political parties. So we need to take all of that into consideration in order not to merely lash the Sudanese experience. The third paper in terms of the experience of Al-Turabi. I believe that Al-Turabi was one of the most courageous people, and the results of his experience have been seen in different areas in the Arab world. But he was a pioneer in that field, and we have seen, and it led to his experience led to a lot of good things in the. I think they are muted now. You are muted.
دكتور سامي
لمزيد من البحث، وانا ادعو باخواننا في المراكز السودانيه والاقسام السودان للتعميق.
I believe that we need to have more studying of that in order to study the Sudanese experience, because other than Sudan, we don't have a Sunni experience in the world other than Sudan, and we need to have that. Maybe the coming symposia will answer that, but I believe that the papers that were presented today were good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Idris. Now we will conclude the first session, and Dr. Hassan, Dr. Mahjoub, and Dr. Soher, they have 4 to 5 minutes to answer as final words, and then we will get to the second session. Dr. Hassan, we will start with you. Do you have any answers or responses to everything or all the comments that were made to your paper? And I hope that you can commit to the time, 4 to 5 minutes, in order to be able to move to the second session. Thank you. I will try to be brief. Maybe I'm not going to answer to all of the questions or comments, but I have some clarifications that I believe are important. First, I would like to say that if we want to make a comprehensive evaluation for the Islamic movement in power, this is a research project that requires years and a complete or a team of researchers. So this is something or some work that I have conducted 2 months ago, and due to this short time and to speak in general terms. However, there is work underway. Maybe it will be published soon. I want to clarify some points related to what Dr. Isam mentioned. He said that in this topic related in relation to the structures, because the movement was expanding every now and then, and this is not precise, because the movement has a strategy and it was expanding according to the political environment that it was working with, and it was changing. So, for example, the environment in the 1960s was completely different to the Maui period, or from the area or the period that had political diversity. And so it was adapting to each period. However, for each one, it has structures and a strategy for making alliances or addressing people based on the environment that it is conducting its work within. Of course, who sets the framework for all of that? Of course, the Islamic movement, because it has it puts the strategy and it has the knowledge on what is appropriate for each period. There are, of course, administrative structure for the tribes, which means that the tribal areas or tribal administration has their own administration. It doesn't mean that we are talking about local administration. This is something related to the tribes only. There are other issues that will be mentioned tomorrow if they are not mentioned in by other speakers.
في موضوع التخطيط المسبق أو التنظير
In terms
المسبق
of the former planning or former strategizing, I will quote what Dr. Hassan al-Turabi mentioned about the way of the work of the Islamic movement, that they implement the theory in action. So he said that the Islamic movement is the son of its environment, and it goes to implementation and performance rather than theorizing. And if there is a disarray between the action and the action and the theory, then it means there is a problem. So that's why it goes to it is keen that the planning and the theorizing is coming from the needs of on the ground, and that's why the political parties law, that al-tawali system, is coming from the practice and not from theorizing. There are several.
Thanks for all the comments that would help us develop this paper as well as the other papers, but this is a huge undertaking that requires years of work of a group of researchers to give this experience its rightful amount of research and consideration. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. The second comment by Dr. Burhan. Thank you so much. Of course, all of those remarks and comments were very helpful, and I also was impressed by the other two papers as well and benefited from them. I would like to comment on 2 points. First of all, the thing mentioned by Dr. Issam and Dr. Nizar, whom I'm thankful for, and the second point was mentioned by Mr. Khalid Hussein. So the point mentioned by Dr. Issam and Dr. Nizar, they talked about that I excluded the means with which the Islamic movement took power, and I judged legitimacy on the practice in governance, on the consequence or the end result. And that's not quite accurate. This is not exactly what I said. So that question is not exactly legitimate. So I am concerned with the means as well as the outcome, the conduct of governance. And I tried to give some examples, and I referred to the problem of the weak functionality that led the government of salvation to its end. And this also responds to what Dr. Nizar mentioned, which is that he never saw any paradigm shift. And of course, the paradigm shift is not in the means by which they took power, because this is the most common means of getting to power. But the paradigm shift was in the management of the state or the government, and the most important thing was for the state to serve its own citizens, because this is the essence of the social contract. So the paradigm shift was in relation to the practical public conduct of the state. I hope this answers your question. As for the other question, of course, disagreement doesn't mean we have problems, but Khalid and I may represent two different mentalities. So Khalid tries to look for classifications. We have to slow down in terms of passing judgments. I said that my methodology is not based on absolutism, on final ultimate judgments and value judgments. To the best of our knowledge, we evaluate things. If absolutism was the method, was the right approach, then we would not be held to account for our own actions by God. But there is a range of options, and that's exactly why we have that range of options and decision making. And that's why we need to review experiences. And not everything that is what I'm trying to say is I believe that the means by which you take power determines very much the degree of legitimacy that you have. Uh, and that's exactly why, because when you impose yourself on the people, you are obsessed with maintaining that power because that power was not given to you or delegated to you by the ballot box. And this would conjure and invoke reactions that would undermine your own governance. And this is what we have seen in the experience of Sudan. As for the uh, position towards the West, let me very humbly say that I have some relatively accurate tools of considering our position to the West. So I think I can manage my relation to the West without being subservient to the Western agenda, nor being in opposition or in a contradiction to the Western thought. And without selling out to the West, to and this is important to take into consideration. We need to look at our position towards the West in a more rational manner. So I tend to think in operational terms to make to reach ideas that have practical implications. Of course, I will stop here, but I hope I will take up this discussion with my colleague Khalid again, and I would like to extend my thanks to all those who commented on our papers. Thank you, Mr. Mahmoud Haroun. The last comment now by Dr. Suhair.
طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace be upon Prophet Muhammad. I thank all of the people who commented, and we benefited from all of those comments. I would talk about 2 points. First of all, the hard power. I believe that our experience with Numeri, or the experience of the Islamic movement with Numeri, they took into consideration the power of economics, media, and army. And this internationally is called the hard power. They might have succeeded somewhere, but not elsewhere in this issue. As for external relations, I will not go into details, but in terms of Sheikh Hassan's vision of an external or foreign intervention. At the end of the Numeri reign, there was much external pressure, and it was very clear, and the information was leaked that he was pressured to crush the Muslim Brotherhood, or his own government would be overthrown. And after that, we had the National Unity Government, and then a government in partnership with the National Ummah or Nation Party. But there were many pressures to exclude the Muslim Brotherhood from the government. In addition, at the time, the leadership of the army itself was of leftist background. So Sadiq al-Mahdi was also put in pressure to kick out the Muslim Brotherhood. So even within a democratic experience, the Muslim Brotherhood was threatened with being excluded. So afterwards, it turned out that even democracy, if it gives birth to Muslim rule or an Islamic movement, it would be refused. And this is something that has been proven right in Egypt, Algeria, and in Tunisia as well. It proved the theory that even if the Islamic movement come to power through democratic elections, they will be refused. During the Salvation government rule, they also were under much pressure. But what I mentioned were only examples. There were also external powers who had agents and arms in Sudan that affected the stability, the economy, the politics, and the very power and strength of the state. So, and of course, there was much polarization introduced into the opposition in Sudan, and the international organizations and human rights organizations were introduced in under that as a cover, as a legitimate cover. And when we started, we had the sanctions, but when we started to extract petrol or oil, we were banned from that because those international firms were banned from working in Sudan. And this affected the thought of Muslim Brotherhood, not only in Sudan, but across the world, because they have come to be convinced that even if they try to engage in the democratic political process, the international community would punish them with a military coup, and that the international community would tolerate some military coups, but not others, will tolerate some civilian revolutions, but not others. So all of those external, well-known pressures are well-known, but I probably skipped some of them due to the limitation of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Suhair, and I thank everyone of the colleagues who contributed and commented. And I thank our speakers as well for their efforts and for their presentations, which were concluded by Dr. Suhair, who said that the international community believes that Islam and government are not to go together. Let's start our next session about the evaluation of policies and performance. We will have two sessions on the same topic, one this afternoon and the second will be tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, we had three speakers today. We were supposed to be have three speakers today, but Dr. Salam unfortunately will not be able to speak with us as he is recovering an illness. We will start with Mr. Amin Hassan Omar, who talks about politics and society. He's got a PhD in political science, and he's an author and journalist. And he worked as a media advisor to the president, as well as in the Ministry of Information, and he contributed to the peace file in the south, and he took part in negotiations with Darfur, and he works at the university now. The second speaker, or the second presentation, was written by Mr. Mu'taz Musa Abdullah, who was a former Prime Minister of Sudan, but because he is recovering, this would be introduced by Dr. Khalil Muhammad Ali, who has a PhD in strategic studies and a master's degree in strategic studies, and a former minister and a former wali of one of the states, and governor of one of the states of Darfur. And he will, the paper he's going to introduce is about development and economics, which is what Mr. Nasser has just mentioned. So let's start with the presentation of Dr. Amin Hassan Omer, and then we will have two comments, one by Dr. Ibrahim Zain from Doha and the other from Dr. Mahdi Ibrahim. Dr. Amin, you have 25 minutes. Praise be to God, and peace and blessings to the Prophet Muhammad. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. My paper is about political performance of the Islamic rule in Sudan. I thought I would focus on the idea of participation and institutions. Actually, I don't exactly like or the idea of using the word space, but if we talk about an arena, then we will be more accurate in identifying the actors. So in the Sudanese political arena, I used space in my official paper, but I would prefer to use the political arena in Sudan. But let me start by an introduction related to the image of the Islamic movement in Sudan and across the world. The image of the Islamic movement usually varies with two aspects, which are not quite realistic. Neither is quite realistic. The first is by Western impacted media, and also, of course, by others who have no access to details or information and receive that image that is much impacted by the West in the media and in academia as well, not only of the Islamic movement, but in or Islamic terms. The other image, unfortunately, is held by many Islamists of their own movement, which is the exact opposite, which is one of ornamentation and justification. So it lacks a critical point of view, so it's not quite helpful in developing the experience of the Islamic movement. And any critical view would be excluded or played down from that point of view. That's why I believe that the Islamic movements have to develop their ways and their means of presenting themselves. Unfortunately, I worked, of course, in the media sector, but the media sector cannot create the image of the state. The state has to create its own image and would request the media to support it. But to do any image that is based on false cosmetics would only lead to a worse image. So the image should be one that is serious, faithful, and reflective of the truth in order to really present the right and good image of the Islamic movement, particularly if we're talking about the political arena, because the political arena is full of emotions and biases, and it's a very dynamic arena full of changes and surprises. So when we talk about this experience to provide model answers, so to speak, will reach nowhere, because that's no approach to politics. So academics cannot evaluate a political experience from a purely abstract academic point of view or a model answer point of view. On the other hand, people cannot evaluate the reality by trying to justify it instead of trying to correct it. So what we need is not a snow white sort of image, and neither coal dark or coal black image. We need something in between. But unfortunately, Western-backed and Western-influenced academics as well as media persons contribute to that image. There are important introductions when speaking about the Islamic movement in Sudan. We have to be aware that the Islamic movement itself did not change or was not transformed from a movement to a party, an Islamic party. This is important to recognize. It, as a movement, it created an entity that is 10 times bigger than it is, which is an Islamic entity, and it became part of that entity. So to call this the experience of the Islamic movement, if we have in mind while saying this the Islamic organization or the Islamic entity, that's not really accurate, because, for example, the Sudanese Islamic movement, ever since it was established, was associated with Sufi, Salafi, and the tribal and community-based groups, and even in the constitutional front, 75% of the front were constituted from those components. And then we had the National Front, in which the Islamic Front took up other allies, and was part of a whole. And then also the National Islamic Front, which was a very broad entity as well, if we are to estimate the number of members who founded this front. It was voted by more than 1 million persons in at the time. So you can imagine how big it was, and how big was its support. So, be it we're talking about advantages or disadvantages, we have to know and recognize that we're talking about the experience of a broad-based Sudanese experience, at the core of which, of course, was the Islamic movement, but not the whole. So, if the so can we suppose the Islamic movement to be able to make and to translate its own visions completely, like it wrote them down? That's not true, because it was seeking consensus with its allies and with the other components as well. So, what is the image of Islamists in Sudan? And sorry, what is their vision of an political regime? Actually, the Islamic movement was a political movement from the early stages, because its first conference in 1954 in 1954, they held a university conference, which was the conference which started the constitution movement. And this conference, as I mentioned, which created the front of the constitution, and of course, it was a political entity, not as a party, but as a lobby group. It was a very active lobby group in the political arena. So Turabi and his peers, he was one of many peers who would discuss with him and talk with him, and were always told as though Turabi was like the awaited Al-Mahdi. He was a pioneering thinker and intellectual, but he was not the awaited Mahdi and the sole thinker. So the experience of the Islamic movement was a political one. It did not offer itself as a model, nor did it at any point ask or claim to be an example to be followed, nor does it look at any other experience as a role model. The sole role model is our Prophet Muhammad. Otherwise, we learn from here and there, from the Islamic heritage, from the West, from any source of wisdom, and our own experience is based on our affiliation and our allegiance to our own faith, rather than a laboratory experiment, so to speak. So we are practicing politics like we practice our religion and our worship. And of course, there are some pitfalls and setbacks, and people are supposed to learn from those studies, and no one would call themselves fault free. And actually, politics is full of pitfalls. It's very easy to be a political leader and say very nice words, but when you face the challenges and the pressures and the temptations and the threats, etc., the situation is very different. The Islamic movement contributed to politics at an early stage, and it was lucky because it grew in a society that did not repulse it. They grew in a community that was Islamist by nature, and so the Islamic movement was not divorced from the public sentiment. And also, along with the Sufist bloc, they were tolerant and easygoing, which unfortunately has changed now, probably, or started to change now. So they started to contribute at a very important and at a very early stage in the 60s and 70s in the government of coalition, etc. And their political contributions were quite broad, and they contributed to the political rivalry, like Sudanese themselves know. And so their experience was not as drastic as the other Islamic movements in other states, where they were excluded and forcefully removed from political life. However, the Islamic movement realized that the general situation in Sudan needed to change. Sudan was not Egypt, nor was it Turkey, Syria, Iran, or any other state. It is an African state with limited resources.
الكلي للسودان سنة 89 عندما استلمت السلطة الجبهة.
The gross domestic product of Sudan was only $15 billion. Only you would understand the economic power. Because when the figures are taken from the World Bank, when the government of salvation left, the GDP was the gross domestic product was more than 100 billion. So we realize that we can make no political movement with a society that's fragmented, that's stagnant, that has in 1989, the official statistics of UNESCO said that 55% of the people were illiterate, but in 2018 there were 28%. So we may stand idly by and mock and assess, so to speak, those experiences without looking at those important facts. So in my paper, I did not talk about the political participation as my colleagues talked about, but most importantly, I talked about the federal government and federal system, which made many people who were not politically active to become politically active as members of local parliaments, as governors, etc. Like we're talking about thousands of leaders and hundreds of thousands of activists in political terms and millions of participants. So what have we done? We had a referendum in Darfur. The people who took part were 8 million people with more than 90% percentage of participation. So there was a real expansion of political activity and political action. So what do we mean about by the conference system? I was involved in this system even before 1989, and the idea of a conference system started to be introduced in theoretical terms before 1989, which is a method to reach a broad popular consensus or agreement rather than a party. And this is something we have on record. It is not. And by the way, I have a lecture that's published in 1992 in which I mentioned that we had this popular system that is not the same as the one we have in, or we had in Libya, But in 1996, there was this discussion on when to open the floor for pluralism, where we had elections and we had a national council that was elected, in which parties were included, of course, although the, for example, Al-Ummah party and the Democratic Union party did not participate, but later they were involved and they continued to be active in political life and in the subsequent governments. The Islamic movement, people tend to forget. Of course, they came to power by a coup. Why did they come by a coup? First of all, because there was a military or an armed movement that put pressure on the political system as a whole, Al-Sadiq al-Mahdi, the elected government, in order to abolish Islamic Sharia by the force of arms. And second, in order to facilitate this, the Islamic Front participated in the government, but with a military memorandum. It was ordered to execute them, and they established the so-called national government, which included all the parties, including the Communist Party, although the Communist Party only had 3 seats in the parliament, but they had a number of ministries. They held a number of ministries. So, in addition to that, there was a written proposal. This popular movement made it a condition that the constitution would ban religious parties, so the Islamic Front would be excluded. So whoever would think that we would accept this and we would sacrifice it for democracy is living in illusions. If people try to exclude us, we exclude them. If they use force against us, we use force against them. It's not possible to expect people to betray their own people and betray their own pledges of the system and the principles of our governments. This is as what happens in other Arab states. If they respect the pledge and the oath, we will respect it. If not, we won't as well.
5 دقائق.
5 دقائق على
5 دقائق.
انا تعمل اضاءات الورقه فيها 25 صفحه، تعمل اضاءات قليله
The paper is 25 page long, but let me summarize. The National Conference was not a system of conferences, but it was a title used in which also in 1996 other parties were allowed to compete with it, and we had elections which were monitored by international agents, and also the other elections were monitored by the European Union and the African Union. So all of those elections were fair and free. So I am surprised that because the Islamist movement came through a coup, a military coup, all the elections are dismissed. So that's not fair. All of the governments since the Salvation government, there was no single government in which it was purely Islamist. There was actually a government in which there were only 3 Islamists, which was the National Unity Government, and all parties contributed, including the Communist Party. There was no party in Sudan that did not take part in the government. None of those parties were deprived of headquarters, offices, etc. I'm saying this because many people refer to authoritarianism as though the situation was very dire. Of course, I'm not trying to justify the military or security or violence options that were taken at certain points, but also the truth is there were freedoms not only for parties to be established, but also to be active and involved in political life. Since 2005 until 2010, many of those parties were part of the government and the ministries.
والقبلة 52%. انا احب ان الكلام ده من الناس المذكور في كل هذه الورقه بالتفصيل. ولذلك القول محاوله تصوير.
This is mentioned in details in my paper. So let's not refer to an authoritarian state that was established by the Islamist movement. That's not true. The truth is the Islamist movement established an imperfect state with some fatal errors that allowed some individuals, figures, or certain categories to overrule institutions and to establish a one-man show. I'm not to disagree with that, and I'm not trying to justify that, but we need to be realistic and to present the facts and the details of the facts rather than the conceptions and expectations. I will not take much more of your time. This paper I leave in your hands. If you give me more time, I will give you more details. As it refers also to the expansion of education. Who established civil education from 1989? In the Salvation government actually established more educational institutions, 5 times more educational institutions, and more educational cover than any time before.
واي انسان يمكن يتصور الحركيه التي يمكن ان ينشئها التعليم. وانا دائما بقول لاخواننا التعليم الما مهني يعني وما فني هو الذي اودى بالانغاز، لانه هو الذي خرج مئات الالاف من الشباب.
This education helped hundreds of thousands of young people who graduated without the labor market to absorb them. So if those young people were uneducated and remained in their rural areas and they did not study in universities and high schools, the streets would not have filled with people opposing the state. Also, if I refer to the issue of women's rights and empowerment, we had only 2 women at the beginning, Mr. Suad and Zakiya, but now women in the most recent parliament, we had more than 35% of women parliament members, and also some women and female judges. So who and a female judge in the Supreme Court, and the president of the judiciary in Khartoum, the biggest judiciary, was a woman. So to talk about the empowerment of women is the empowerment of half of society, and these are the approaches I tried to introduce and to consider here in my paper. And there was also, until 1996, we had no internet, but one of the things that helped overthrow the government of salvation was that 30 million citizens had access to the internet. We have all of those references in this paper in a summary, and because they created the awareness and the political power. When you have those, no state whatsoever would prevent political participation, otherwise it would fall. This is all I wanted to say, and I would answer to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amin. In his intervention, he spoke about the political Sudanese political sphere, and he said that, and he put the Islamic movement in two different visions. One, which is an international vision under the which looks at the Islamic movement in contempt, and the other vision is about those who belong to the Islamic movement and who decorate it and beautify it, which is far away from reality. And he pictured these two pictures, and he said that the state is the one that creates the picture, and the one that the movement, and that it should not be built on imagination. The Islamic movement in Syria didn't move from an organization to a political party. It rather comprehended or absorbed all the groups in the Sudanese society, and it expanded and became larger than tenfold than when it started. And the movement, since its beginning, it hasn't been a traditional da'wah movement. Since the 50s, it has been an organization that was and Al-Turabi was a leader that was participating, and
that they would follow their leader. It was a political experience with its pitfalls and achievements. It did not offer itself as a model or a role model or example to anyone, but it learned from the heritage, from wisdom, from the West, from the experience, which is the experience of the practice of Islamic movement as they practice their religion. And of course, the politics is such an important and a difficult test because, as we all mentioned in all of the papers, they had their own pitfalls.
So he mentioned Al-Numairi and the elections, and that the Islamic project is different from the other countries like Egypt, Turkey, or Iran. The Sudanese political biosphere is different because its resources are limited. And for example, in 2017, its GDP increased hugely, reaching 23 billion US dollars, and this is an achievement. There are other indicators, like for example, literacy, and the thousands of or millions of people who were not part of the politics, and they became part of it.
السياسي. لعل هذه قد تكون من السخريه ان هذه قد تكون ايضا ادت في نهايه الامر الى الخروج.
It shows that this also, and he said that millions of Sudanese were illiterate, and they were educated, and that by itself led them to get into the streets and be part of the political life. Talking about the coup that they made, because they were confronting an armed group that put the Islamists away from governance, and that led them to confront it with weapons. And this was all of the isolating them and not making them to a part of the political life. All of that led them to defend themselves and to use the power. He also said that they made elections. These elections were monitored by international bodies, and they were free and fair elections. There was no exclusivity for the Islamists, and there were so many parties. There were some abuses, that's right, but there were freedoms for all. All parties participated in the parliaments and in the ministries. The Islamists, in the best times, they were only 40%, and the Islamic movement didn't establish a totalitarian state, although there was an individual ruling the country, and he was stronger than the institutions. In terms of the development or the universities, hundreds of thousands of the young people were educated, and they were the ones that toppled the Islamic movement. And in terms of the enablement or enabling women, the women were part of the movement. He said that there were two sisters in the parliament in the beginning, and now there are more than a third of the parliament of women, as well as the leading the judiciary as well. This was the paper of Dr. Khalil Abdullah Muhammad Ali. The second paper will be about economy and development. He has 25 minutes to present. Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, and all peace and blessings be upon Messenger Muhammad. I would like to start by thanking SIGA for organizing this symposium to discuss these important topics, to criticize the Islamic movement in the Arab world. I have a very short intervention about Dr. Muhammad Ahmad Mahjoub Harun, about the reasons that led the Islamic movement to conduct a coup d'etat at the time. There were political policy against the Islamists, especially in the army, especially by the Baathists, and there was a coup before the coup of the Salvation government in 1 week, including the so there was a coup d'etat attempt before the Salvation in 1 week, and after the Salvation of the Salvation coup in 1 year, the Baathists tried to conduct a coup d'etat in 1990 towards the end of Ramadan, and they failed. So they were about to topple the Salvation government. So this was one of the reasons that there were leftist groups that were armed and that were strong, and if they took the lead, they would have cooked everything. The Islamic movement was convinced, just like other groups, that by democracy or through democracy, if democracy continued, they would have achieved a great victory. But that was not realistic, that there will be coups and there were political turbulences in the country by Garang and others, and that led to all of the differences and the situation that we have seen. That's it. And now I will get into the economic aspect. This is a paper that was developed by Dr. Mu'taz Musa. He was the prime minister in Sudan, but he was unable to come to present it, and he gave it to one of the colleagues who was supposed to be here in this program, but he was sick and he couldn't come, so it ended up in my hand to present it to you. So before I start into speaking about this paper, I heard from the previous papers as if the Islamic movement didn't have a vision, a clear vision about how to do governance before the coup in 1979, and that's not correct. When during the reconciliation with the Numairi in the 70s, it was a planning for its future that was hoping to rule Sudan when it gets into power. We lost the voice from the source. The room is muted now. They are muted.
دكتور الصوت عندنا ما مسموع هنا في السودان. هاي كنا عملتها ميوت. هاي تقريبا الدكتور عمل ميوت من عندك هناك.
فيما يتعلق بالورقة، هذه الورقة مقدمتها تقول
So back to the paper. This paper says the Islamists inherited a country that was exhausted. No basic services were there. The infrastructure was very weak. Security was scarce. Education was poor. And as Dr. Hassan Al-Omer mentioned a while ago, the country was with $12.1 billion as GDP, and they left it in 2017 at 123 billion US dollars of GDP. The economy, despite the siege, of course. In 1988, in order to be clear about that, and I was one of the people who witnessed that, we had rain in 1988. In one night, the rain led to stopping life completely. We had electricity was off, water was not provided. The streets were stopped, telecommunications, restaurants stopped working, everything stopped, life stopped literally in that day. And we used to receive planes from Yemen to drop bread for us. So the Salvation received a completely destroyed infrastructure. So this paper discovers or tries to discover the growth or the development trajectory under the Salvation government. The Salvation government divided its policy into phases. Until 1990, it was the time or the period for solving the problems that were storming the country.
هذه كانت المراحل المحصورة في هذه الورقة هي 6 مراحل. فترة التحرير الاقتصادي 92.
Then in 1992, from 1992 to 1999, it was the economic liberation period. So the first one was from 1989 to 1991, and then from 92, and then from 92 to 1999. Then the third phase, or let's speak about the liberation of the economy. The Sudanese economy was based on subsidies, and for example, you don't get the sugar without having the consumption card. And that was we had a great problem to get the material.
مرحلة التحرير حقيقة كانت التخلص من كثير من أوجه الدعم وتحرير كثير من السلع التي كانت تدخل في قائمة.
Then there was so many commodities were subsidized. The third phase was, I'm sorry, we can't hear the speaker because the microphone is not in front of his mouth. It's impossible to hear him like this.
شهدت هذه الفترة أوضاع سياسية.
I'm sorry, we can't hear the speaker.
وشابه عدم اليقين وانصراف الجهد.
So there was lack of trust, and there was some turbulences in the economy, and the economic policy was not very sound. These policies were aiming at reducing the inflation rate and stabilizing the exchange rate. Then the phase that went from 1992 to 1999, this period witnessed a lot of turbulences in the international arena, like the Gulf War, and it was known that Sudan had a part in that. Later, it appeared that we had the wrong position, but it was under pressure because of that. So, in line with those economic international experiences, we started. There was a new attempt to renew the economic system, and most of the commodities were not subsidized, apart from the bread and the basic commodities. This was also had high rates of inflation, and there was no high rates of inflation in the international inflation rate in these years, and that was because of the abundance of the commodities, which has been a reality because of the economic liberation. So in these years, there was a decrease in the inflation rates because of so many reasons, like, for example, decreasing the government expenditure and stopping lending from the banks. In 1993, it was 2.5 the inflation rate, and in 1999 it was 0.5 inflation rate, and that was a great decrease. The researcher also mentions that the growth increased from 5.4 in 1993 to 10.2 in 1999 because of the good management, and that was before discovering oil in Sudan, in the south of Sudan. The third phase was the production of oil from 1999 to 2007, before the international economic crisis. In this field, or in this aspect, the economy it witnessed high rates of growth because of the production and the export of oil. There was more agriculture production and more income. That led to the stability in the exchange rate, and the rates of inflation were very low. For example, in 2010 or 2005, it was only 4.4, the inflation rate. The fourth phase is that accompanied the international financial crisis from 2008 to 2011. And so many countries are related in economic and trade relations with the international or with the advanced countries to get the commodities and to get the services that they need. And Sudan is one of them. So when the crisis happened, so many commodities increased, and the poor countries were impacted hugely because of the increase of prices. This crisis was reflected on the economy of Sudan. But there were some policies that were taken to overcome the negative impacts of this crisis. This also led to the increase of the inflation rate again, which led to which reached 18%. The fifth phase is after the separation, and from 2011 to 2014, when the oil was out of the income or the budget of the government. After the separation of the south of Sudan, it led that Sudan lost a huge amount of its sources and income, and that affected the prices hugely. So from 196.1 to 32.6, which means that was about more than 40% of inflation rate in that year. Sudan also was under huge economic pressure. For example, the sanctions that it was under, the prevention or banning of exporting certain commodities, and importing certain commodities and exporting other production. So the lack of the commodities led to the increase of their prices. The government has developed a program from 2012 to 2014 to evaluate the measures on, or the impact on the economy of Sudan, and then in the taxes were increased from 10% to 18%, and the added value tax was increased, and the customs US dollar was increased from $3 to 4.4 US dollars. Then in the parallel market, the US dollars price was increased as well. And that led to the increase of the inputs of production. Then the 5-year plan or a program that was supposed to continue from 2015 to 2020, but of course it stopped because of the change of regime in 2016. So or in 2018. So the reports will be only between 2015 and 2018 until 2018. Sudan was under huge pressure, but the economic processes led to the increase from 15.7 GDP to 32.7 GDP, and then since January The year started in the 11 pounds for per dollar, and the year ended in December by 17 pounds per dollar. In 2017, the GDP was about 2.8 after a growth of 3.89 per year in 2016, in comparison with the 6.7 in 2015. So the average was about 4.4%, and that performance was appropriate for the having a stable economic development. This paper is being discussed in some or tackles a matter that is discussed in popular circles. There was a huge amount of counterfeited currency that were printed outside Sudan, and huge amounts of them were smuggled into Sudan.
يعني انا اقول لك والله واحد من اصدقائي يعني يعمل في صادر
One of
الماشيه.
my friends who was exporting camels, for example, he said that the camel in Omdurman market used to be sold about 15,000 pounds. When those counterfeit money reached, it became 30,000 per camel, and even more than that. And of course, we're talking about a lot of commodities like camels, sheep, and they were exported from or imported from other countries. So this contributed largely to the inflation of prices.
الفترة هذه شهدت أربع تطورات هامة، هي التحرير الاقتصادي، اكتشاف البترول، وثورة التعليم العالي، وثورة الاتصالات.
There was development in higher education and in the telecommunication, and all of these things lead to, or show the importance of the economic work, including, for example, the decrease of the inflation and the stability of the exchange rate, and ensuring the level of livelihood for all people, achieving balanced development. As for the economic indicators, the country from 1989 to 2015 witnessed great growth in the macroeconomy, which in 1989, actually, the budget increased to 128 million US dollars, as well as an increase of the share per capita of which doubled in 2012. I don't know the number.
And خروج النفط من اقتصاد السودان. يعني معدل النمو لم يتحول الى سالب بالرغم من خروج النفط من معادله الاقتصاد السوداني. سجل معدل التضخم 75.3% في العام 89، ثم انخفض الى 4.4% في العام 2007، وبدا في تصاعد الصدمات وضغوط دوليه ومحليه ليصل 32% في العام 2017. طبعا الان يا جماعه وصل 400 وكسر يعني. صاحب النمو الاقتصادي زياده كبيره في الاستثمار الاجنبي الذي تضاعف اكثر من 200 ضعف، إذ ارتفع من 188 مليون جنيه في العام 1989 إلى 40 مليار جنيه في العام 2011، ثم ارتفعت الاستثمارات إلى أكثر من 600 ضعف عندما بلغت 171 مليار جنيه في العام 2018. كان عدد المصارف في عام 1989 5 مصارف فقط، وشهدت الفترة التالية وشهدت الفترة التالية
The next period witnessed a growth in the banking sector, and we have 35 banks working, and then 39 in 2008, and the branches number doubled in the states, about 23 fold, so from 60 branches in 1989 to 562 branches in 2011, working across the country. And then we got into programs with international and regional institutions to develop a strategy for financial comprehensiveness with the banks. The central bank had 7 branches in 1989 to have 17 centers or branches in each state. Before 1989, we don't have any exchange or currency exchange companies, and then in 2080 we have plenty of companies. In 2011, the deposits in the banking increased about 11 folds because they became from 11 billions in 1989 and increased to 447 billion pounds in 2016. The imports were from 3.36 in 1989 to a very large number in 2015. In terms of the all of the other technological life, it increased to 25 millions in 2012, which means that they were increased 13 folds in comparison with 1989. In terms of the exports of gold, in 1989 it was 5 million, over 5 million. In 2012 it increased to 10 million. 10 million kilos. But I have a comment here about that. When the South separated from Sudan and the oil went with the South, this was one of the negative aspects. The gold could have compensated for that loss.
لكن أقول كان يمكن للحكومة أن تتعامل مع الذهب كما تعاملت مع البترول. يعني تركت
The
هذا
government could have worked with the gold as it worked with the oil, because there was, for example, this process was made by the civil mining, and this is a very problematic because, for example, someone who used to work as an assistant of a driver or a truck driver.
For example, the owner of this firm called him and he told him, let's make you an assistant with this driver until you learn and you have a license in loyalty to your father. So the owner of this company had an agreement with the UNIFIL forces of the UN, and in the first mission they arrived at 3 and they worked up till 3, so they refused to get him into this place, and the driver argued with this security officer, and the UNIFIL talked to the company and said that if this is repeated, we will cancel your contract. So he was dismissed and he became unemployed.
وهذه سيارة تستخدم في تنقية الذهب حوالي كثير يعني وعليها جركانات فيها عدد من الناس.
And he saw this car, this vehicle with a number of people. He helped them. They told him they were going to excavate for gold. Can the speaker speak to the microphone, please? So this young man managed, after a long time, to excavate for gold, and he have his own personal reserve of gold is about 25 tons. So this is the wealth of the state. This should not have fallen into the hands of a single young man, no matter how hardworking. And also the electricity yield increased in all types of generation, whether through thermal generation and whether through water generation through the dams, as you have heard about the number of dams that were planned and that were in place, in addition to actually solar power. There are some stations for solar power generation, but in terms of figures, the government of salvation, all of the electricity in Sudan was at best 400 kilowatt, and it increased to around 1,000, and Sudan was linked to Egypt and Ethiopia, and most of the areas of Sudan were on the grid of power. And also, when we mentioned oil, we forgot to say that there were very important new facilities, including some production facilities that were very broad, and there were also pipelines reaching to export ports. And those facilities are now being leased by the government of South Sudan with generate revenue for North Sudan. And of course, the recent crises in regional countries and in neighboring countries affected us, because also they tap into our resources as well. So also the rate of poverty decreased to less than 30% in 2015. Hospitals were around 209, and it was double that figure in 2018, reaching more than 600 hospitals, in addition to the number of hospital beds doubled as well.
الجامعات الحكومية 34 جامعة حكومية غير الجامعات الخاصة.
And we have double the number of public universities, in addition to dozens of private universities, and double the number of teachers and students in higher education.
السوداني كانت بيئة طبعا غير مساعدة طبعا، بل بالعكس يعني كانت معادية. فالحروب التي أديرت
Sudanese economy was also affected by the fierce wars against the government of salvation. And let me mention something that has not been mentioned by previous speakers, that the government of salvation was able to mobilize the Sudanese people to defend their own country. So hundreds of thousands of people were involved with the Sudanese, alongside the Sudanese army, in defending their land. After 2019, we had an increase in inflation and setback in GDP from 123 in 2019 17 to 100 billion in 2021, in addition to setbacks in education and health sectors. No graduate has graduated over the past 3 years. I have statistics for that. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalil Al-Abdullah. He talked about economy and development, and he said there was a vision before the government of salvation took power, and it's used to plan for the time when it takes power. And one of the things it worked upon was external or foreign affairs and foreign relations, as well as economic relations. And they were the first to establish Islamic banks and Islamic insurance companies, in addition to Al-Zakah Council. The GDP increased to more than 100 billion. Despite the siege, they inherited a completely collapsed system, and that the graph of and the curve of development went through 6 stages. At the beginning, it was securing the power, and then economic liberalization until 1996, where there were subsidies to the poor. The third was oil production, in which we had more stability. It was between 2000 and 2007, and then we had the international crisis between 2008 and 2011, which caused many economic challenges. The fifth was the separation of the South, and the sixth was the 5-year program, which started in 2015 and stopped in 2018. There were challenges at every stage, including the Gulf War, the fluctuating consumption rates, and international changes. There were very important economic changes in Sudanese economy, such as the increase in education and other sectors. And he also talked about some of the indicators of the per capita income and the per capita GDP share in GDP, and the increase in exportation, including the exportation of gold, the power grid, the ratio of student-teacher ratios. And also he mentioned that the situation and the international as well as the regional context was not very conducive. So if we compare the performance with the deterioration after 2019, then the question is, if we have all of those positive indicators, why did we end up with this toppling of this system? So this is something that the paper did not quite answer. We have 2 comments by contributors from Doha and Khartoum. Let's start from Doha with Dr. Ibrahim Zain. Please go ahead.
دكتور سامي
من 12 إلى 15
How
دقيقة.
much time do I have? Between 12 and 15 minutes. So we have a contribution from Morocco, but it's not available right now as well. And Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I would like to thank the chairman of this session, as well as Mr. Amin Ahmad Omer, and the colleague who presented the paper of Dr. Mu'taz. First of all, in relation to the paper of my friend and colleague, Dr. Amin Hassan Omer, and let's start with what he started off with, which is the image of the Islamic movement in Sudan and dialectics, and the problems of this image between criminalization and undermining made by international media institutions, and institutions that are generally anti-Islamist. versus the other justifying approach taken by some members of the movement in order to whitewash this image and defend the Islamic movement, to give an image that's also inaccurate. And what Dr. Amin Omer wanted us to adopt is to undertake constructive criticism in order to understand the experience and to agree on ways in which we can overcome those challenges. And I believe this is something we can agree upon, and this is the right approach to review what we have in this experience. Let me start with the issue of political participation and the achievements of the movement as described by Dr. Hassan Omer, which was quite accurate, but as can be testified to by all of those who are familiar with the situation in Sudan. You would know that the image presented by him is quite accurate and true. This political participation achieved many things, actually. One of the most important achievements is the idea of the National Congress or Conference as a political party which reached to the federal system or governance in Sudan. This led to a constitution that defined the powers of the federal government and the sub-governments, but the presidential flagrant intervention into local authorities caused the trouble. So despite the fact that this conference system or Congress system was one of the best ways in which Sudan in modern history could be governed, all governments in Sudan lacked such political arrangements or political management of political participation at the various levels, leadership, middle and local levels. But all of this was undermined because of the problems within the party itself and because of the totalitarian approach. And all of this led to the undermining of the genuine meaning of federal governance. Only achievement in this case would be the establishment of the National Congress or the National Conference. But this was undermined, as I mentioned. But let me ask a question. This broadening of political participation أطاع
ولم يستطع يبدو ذلك واضحا لم يستطع
It seems clear that the ruling party was unable to attract
للحركة المسلحة التي كان يقودها
some of the ranks who were in support of the military or armed movement led by Garang, which is one of the failures of the political of the Islamic movement, which is that it could not attract even Muslim people in the south, because people in the south are not only Christian. And it seems that the performance of the Islamic movement was not up to expectation, and also the comprehensive peace agreement led by international forces, one which gave the South the right of self-determination, which was one of the fundamental errors made by the regime in Sudan, by a state that's recognized by the United Nations to concede the right of self-determination to part of the territory, comprising third the territory and fifth the population, and more importantly, it includes the backbone of the economy of the state, as what Mr. Mu'taz mentioned, which means that so how can you let go of such resources or of such a portion of your own territory? So the Islamic movement might have achieved a relative success in the north, but has failed miserably in the south and ended up providing them with self-determination, and they chose to separate from the state of Sudan, and I believe that this is a failure for which the Islamic movement in Sudan has to recognize and review. And actually, this political participation also failed miserably in Darfur, where armed forces or armed movements appealed to many of the youth who supported them against the central government. So with all due respect to Mr. Amin Hassan Omer, whose paper I believe includes many important spotlights to review and move forward with the Sudanese Islamist movement. As for the paper of Mr. Mu'taz, there is an apologetic tone to that paper, and maybe what Mr. Sami mentioned, if what has happened is so rosy as reflected in the figures you mentioned, in the expansion in health, education, bridges and roads, in electricity, hospitals, commodities. If things were so rosy, then the revolution of December 2019 was at the end of the day because of economic failure. It wasn't because of Islam, or it wasn't in opposition to the Islamic project, but it was exactly because of the failure of managing the facilities and the functions of the state in economic terms, issues related to bread and basic needs. Of course, revolutions cannot be reduced to those basic needs, but I believe that the question of Dr. Sami Al-Arian is very much relevant. Why then have we had this revolution if the situation was so rosy as this paper reflects? So I would like to say something here mentioned by Mr. Sadiq Al-Mahdi in an interview in 1994, I believe, where he was asked what is the thing that the Salvation government succeeded in and he failed in. And he said, and I believe he was right, he said that the Salvation government succeeded in collecting taxes, and we failed miserably in collecting taxes in our government. But I believe that we should not take this to mean collecting taxes literally, but actually the government of Salvation established a state. So I would disagree with what was mentioned in the first session, which is that the government of Salvation did not establish a state and established a parallel institution. I believe that the government of Salvation managed to change the state from a state that governs only the main city and few cities to a state that was very active and present across Sudanese territories, and it practiced it offered services and it collected taxes across Sudan. So I believe that although the paper of Mr. Mu'taz involves description, figures, and comparisons that we may not totally disagree with, but I believe that we need to look at those figures more closely and in order to examine them in a way that is far from being apologetic to the regime. And I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to comment on those two papers, and I hope that Mr. Amin Ahmad Hassan Omer would send me his final paper in his final version, and I believe it would contribute greatly to the future of political movement in Sudan. Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, for your comments. The second comment would be by Dr. Yassir Mustafa. As I mentioned, he was the Minister of Trade and Industry and a member of a committee that established the policies of the economy at the time. After that, we will allow for one intervention for 5 minutes. From Khartoum, you would delegate one person to speak on your behalf, and we will have a final comment from Istanbul. And finally, the comments or the response by our two speakers. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, praise be to God, to Allah. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I will try to present my point of view in regards to this paper presented by Mr. Mu'taz, although I haven't read the paper as a whole, but based on the presentation, I would like to comment. One of the important issues is that we should have, when we are talking about the Islamic movement, to separate it from the government of salvation. And we need to consider the contributions of the Islamic movement in the economy and their policies and their strategies and how they translated them in practice. I don't want to elaborate a lot, but I would like to say that this process started even before the reconciliation in May, the May reconciliation, and the movement started to establish some economic entities and apparatuses, and started also to establish Islamic banks and Islamic insurance companies, and they took up a role in the in Sudanese economy. And during this time also, the movement started to affect economic relations inside and outside Sudan. And they started also to present themselves as a movement that aspires for a future role in the management of economy. As some of my colleagues mentioned, the movement have introduced its strategy and a strategic plan in terms of enablement and empowerment during the reconciliation period in 1977. So it took the liberty during that time to organize itself in terms of its strategic thinking, to outline its own economic strategy for the management of the state as a whole. And this idea was crystallized when the movement came to power. They had their strategy, and as our colleague tried to point out, they had 6 phases, but I would like to focus on 2 points. First of all, the process of strategic planning. So from the beginning, the movement had this vision to start its activities in economic fields from a strategic point of view, and those programs started with the first phase. The tripartite program, in which there was a recognition of the fact that the economy was totally government planned, and hence we needed an opening of the economy and liberalization of many of the aspects of the economy. And the second phase was based on the recognition that the economy was too dependent on external support, be it in direct aid or in finance and funding from external agencies. And I believe, I remember that when we worked on this in the government, we found that 86% of the state was dependent on external funding.
الاستراتيجيه بتاعت انه عدم الاعتماد على الخارج وانما الاعتماد على استثمار موارد البلاد مستغله في ذلك امكانات.
They started with a vision to invest the resources of the state and open relations with external state. This was intertwined with the program of economic liberalization because it could have some effect in increasing the cost of life. So the third step was to establish a social element in order to accommodate for those side effects of this economic liberalization, and it helped actually in that. And after that, we had the strategy, which was called the 10-year strategy, which I believe was the first instance of strategic planning in Sudan. That's very different from previous experiences in Sudan. It was the plan between 1992 and 2002. It was quite comprehensive, taking all aspects of life: social, economic, health, education, security, etc., and even external and foreign relations. So it was quite comprehensive. And it was agreed by a large number of Sudanese, not all of whom were members of the Islamic movement. It was the first strategy that constituted a genuine change in the mode and the way of thinking in strategic planning. It was somewhat successful. It ended in 2002. In my own evaluation, it was all in all more than 70% successful in the aspects it worked upon. It was followed by another strategy, which was broader in terms of participation by other powers apart from the government or apart from the Islamic movement. So it included technocrats and even other elements. So it expanded in terms of freedoms and pluralism, in addition to expansion on other aspects of the strategy. Okay, 2 minutes.
أنا الذي يهمني في هذه
What I'm most concerned about here in this strategy is the developmental aspect. Of course, Mr. Mu'taz detailed about the performance, the actual performance of the economy during that period. But what I would like to say is that in those 10-year strategies, the focus was on development in all sectors. So if we talk about development in the state, we talk about industry, agriculture, etc. But in this strategy, we talked about development across all sectors, including infrastructure, thought, intellectuals, media, society, and all the details mentioned by Mr. Amir in his, or Karim, in his presentation. But most importantly, this development which happened during this time was unprecedented in Sudan at all levels and in all fields.
كان الاتصالات في السودان تفوق كل الاتصالات في العالم العربي بما فيه السعودية.
3 years, the amount or the development in the communications sector exceeded that in other regional powers such as Saudi Arabia. Actually, this experience was presented to the World Bank as an experience that was successful despite the economic sanctions and without dependence on external aid. And this communication development took place, and it was also paralleled by in other sectors, but it is at the same time important to talk about the setbacks and the problems that hindered the yielding the fruit of any of those strategies, or those strategies not being reflected in performance. Why were we not able to reap the fruit of those strategies? Those strategies, those programs and policies were confronted by many challenges, some of which were circumstantial, such as the international crisis, and others were deliberate and planned, and others because of subjective setbacks. So, of course, there were setbacks and pitfalls by the government itself. So, under all those circumstances, the state had to deal with things in unorthodox manner. So many of the things that the state should have undertaken directly, they had to privatize some of the activities and delegate some of the power to the private sector. And of course, the private sector, of course, has profit considerations supersede any other consideration. And as my colleague mentioned, not everything that was done in this period was the action of the Islamic movement itself, but it was also in cooperation with other elements and components in economy. Actually, the contribution was quite diversified. So the role of the Islamic movement in economy, I believe, was less than 10% of the economy, because the economy was based on society, and because of the traditional conventional economic structures which persisted. And although Islamists were in power in political terms, but they had no choice but to deal with existing economic structures and entities, particularly under the boycott and the pressure. That's why the outcome involved many setbacks, including corruption or incompetence. So those outcomes and those setbacks hindered reaping the fruits of those strategies. And one of the important reasons commented upon by my colleague to answer to Dr. Sami's question, why did the people take to the streets when things were so rosy? Actually, this was made and constructed through media and communication, social media, and it wasn't overnight. Unfortunately, the state was too busy in day-to-day management, and they disregarded this aspect, and this disregard caused this problem. I am sorry to not having been able to talk about all the aspects I wanted to discuss, but thank you so much for giving me a chance. Thank you so much, Dr. Yassir.
أعطيت كثير من النقاط والأسئلة التي أثيرت. نحن سنسمح
You have
الآن
covered many of the aspects. We will have a comment from Al-Khartoum and the final one from Istanbul, and then we will conclude. Is there any comment from Istanbul here? Would anyone like to comment? Yes, Dr. Idris, please go ahead.
نفس السؤال الذي طرحته أنت. يبدو لي أنه
I have the same question you posed actually. It seems to me that Dr. Amin and the other colleague who presented the other paper, they have their scientific approach, but also they are appeasing the status quo in a way.
هو يريد رفاهية يريد قال الدكتور أمين قال
People who were 30 years old in 2019. So when you say that this education and communication revolution was brought, that caused the revolution, was brought about in the first place by the government of salvation, that's true. But in order to manage this correctly,
هذه بعض التخوفات القائمة الآن في تركيا نفسها. حتى الأرقام أكثر بكثير.
So I'll be very brief. Hello? Microphone, please. Any comment from Khartoum?
في تعقيبه على ورقة الدكتور أمين أو الدكتور معتز.
Do you have anyone who would like to comment on the papers just presented?
طيب لا في أحد الأخوة. تفضل أخي. عرف بنفسك لو تكرمت.
تمام.
أعطينا 10 دقائق. في أحد؟
Okay, so do we have any comment?
نعم تفضل أخي.
ناس معقد هنا من الخرطوم.
ما نسمع معذرة.
ما في معقد من الخرطوم.
لا يوجد معقد. طيب في دكتور شكيب ممكن إذا تحب دقيقتين عندك شيء؟
We don't have any comment from Khartoum. Mr. Shakib, do you have anybody there? Then we are going to conclude by Dr. Khalid, then by
السلام عليكم. مر في الحديث قطاع الاتصالات باعتباره أحد المشاريع التنموية في السودان الحديث.
In one of the development projects in New Sudan, or modern Sudan was at the level of telecommunications. Telecommunications from Khartoum to Yemen was cheaper than communication within Yemen. So we were the second best telecommunications that we have, because telecommunications in Sudan was a private company, but at the level of the government, we didn't have any successful project. We had so many universities as well as training centers. The number of graduates from Sudanese universities, or those who have PhD and reach 15 million graduates without quality education or without having good quality.
ما فيش جامعة سودانية بما في ذلك جامعة الخرطوم داخلة في التصنيف العالمي.
The Sudanese universities were out of the international ranking, which means that the Sudanese universities
من أغلب البرامج
in the
العالمية
last 2 years were out of the international ranking. And
بمعنى أنه خريجي جامعة الخرطوم عام 90 مختلف تماما عن خريجي جامعة الخرطوم عام 2000.
in 1990 was completely different from education in Khartoum in 2000 and in terms of quality and spread and exposure. Okay, Dr. Amin, now you have 5 minutes to comment on what has been presented in the lecture.
unmute.
يعني سأثبت في الورقة من بعد لك بالتفاصيل التقارير بتاعت اليونسكو.
In some of the details, I included the UNESCO numbers that prove the quality of education, and the Sudan was not outside the ranking of education. The last 3 years, of course, it was out because there is no education. It is stopped. For 3 years, no one graduated. So of course, it should be out of the international ranking. But before, it had ranking amongst the international universities, and they were adding in other countries. They were adding 10% on the university or on the education. On the license that was coming from Sudan. Do you have a problem in the sound?
يا دكتور نحن ما سامعينك.
وذاك ما كان سامع.
تفضل دكتور ابراهيم. دكتور امين.
Dr. Amin, go ahead once again. Did you hear what I said before? Now we hear you. Go ahead. I started my comment saying that about the quality of education in Sudan and what has been said, it's not correct. And my terms of reference is the reports of the UNESCO. It's not something that is published in newspapers. That's true. In the last 3 years, Sudan was out, doesn't have any ranking because there is no education. It stopped. We don't have any graduates for the past 3 years. The universities and the schools are closed. So it is normal in the last 3 years. But this doesn't mean but we're not talking about that. If the period that we are talking about, you have to go back to the reports of UNESCO and not something that was published in newspapers. And it is not correct that we had 1 million PhD graduates without a good education. This is not correct, and this is categorically wrong. Now, if we go to the United States, we went to the United States, and our certificates were accepted without anything because they knew that the Khartoum University was as good as Cambridge University at that time. Of course, there was some impact on education, but in general, the Minister of Education, she was asked about the Sudanese in one country. She was asked about the Sudanese certificate, and she said that they add 10 marks on the Sudanese certificate when they accept one of the students in their universities.
من تجربة السودان لأنه أنا ما مسموع
Do you hear me now?
نعم مسموع.
طيب
نعم
كنت
تفضل.
عايز أقول ماذا ما هي عبرة التجربة؟ أولا في شيء إيجابي من عبرة التجربة أننا
So, from the positive thing from our experience is that we tried to be open and to expand partnership with the political and civil society organizations. Some of them accepted and some of them refrained from that. As for the experience of the Islamic movement, the complete siege and that was put against it should be taken into consideration, and also the political, the enthusiastic political narrative should be taken into consideration, and the poor media, all of that impacted the increase of siege against us, and we hope that this should not be repeated. The third point is the division, and the division had catastrophic results because division and its negative impact on affected the Islamic movement and getting more support. And finally, in the recent years, the state was taking decisions without going back to the parliament, which led to the country to get into wars. And this is an indicator of not paying heed to institutionalization. So the leadership in the state, they looked down at the institutionalization of the Islamic movement. So if they have done that, of course they will be looked down at the people. And in the last 2 years, the leadership was in decline, and the people who got bored with the authority that is not doing its job, and that was shown in the manipulations or maneuvering that was taking place in the authority, and the maneuvering in with the international relations. Even the Islamic movement, even if we say that 40% of the Muslims, we were calling them our credits, and those are the ones who are willing to participate. So Islamic movements should pay heed to renewing the leadership and not allow to any leadership, no matter who they are, especially when they are in power, to look with contempt to the institutionalization of the organization or the opinion of the organization. Thank you very much. And the final comment will be from the gentleman here. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all the interventions. And first, I will start that with what Mr. Taysir Mustafa said, that the paper that was written by Brother Mu'taz Musa talked about the state of the salvation and not the Islamic movement. If you remember, when I started presenting the paper, I tried to speak about the economy before the salvation government, and I excluded the Islamic movement in some of the achievements that were made. But I don't know, maybe Mr. Mu'taz was talking only about the salvation government. And the first 10 years, or the first strategy, it was followed by a 30-year strategy. If that was achieved, it could have moved Sudan with a quantum leap. I will conclude with answering the question why the salvation collapsed. The brother Omer spoke about that a lot, but what I want to add here is that the salvation government, or one of the reasons that led to its collapse, some of them cannot be mentioned in such a gathering. But if it is possible in a closed door meetings, we can say a lot. But what Dr. Hassan Al-Omar mentioned in his final comment is 100% correct. Not renewing the leadership for 30 years leads to a lot of problems. And I recall the leading office of the National Council, Amin Hassan Omar, was the same, and he called for the renewal of all leadership, including the president, or starting with the president, and he paid a high price for that opinion. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Sami and the brothers who organized this symposium, and I hope that you will be rewarded in heaven for that work. And this will help us discuss and analyze our problems in a scientific way, an academic way, to lead us to better experiences in the future. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants and the keynote speakers in Istanbul, Doha, Khartoum, and all around the world for your participation in these important symposia. Tomorrow we have two other important symposia. In each one, we will have four papers to be presented. The first one will be in the morning. It will be in 11 a.m. Istanbul time, 10 a.m. Khartoum, and 8 a.m. Greenwich time. We will have four papers. The first one speaks about the security agencies, the security service, and the Islamist. Mr. Adal Hassan is going to speak about it. The second one will have a paper on the separation of the South, and it is very important to understand what happened and to answer for the question of the separation or the split of the South. And there was also another point of the international aspect. And the third or the final session will be about the lessons learned and what can be expected for the future. So four papers that are very important, and I believe this will be the closed door meeting. And then we will have the reform initiatives and what happened there. And we lost the speaker. Now we don't have any voice coming from the main room. Dr. Sami, you are muted.